This episode of the Vincast, Australia's premier wine podcast, is brought to you in part by Different Drop, an online wine retailer based in Sydney that actually specialises in Australian wines of provenance, authenticity and innovation. If you go to the Different Drop website, you're going to find a huge range of wines from different styles, different varieties, and covering different regions. And the guys at Different Drop have done an amazing job to find some of the most exciting wines being made in Australia at the moment. These really are very small batch wines, so it can often be a case of blink and you'll miss it. Because they really want people who are pushing the boundaries. And in the same way that I try and have guests on the podcast who are really trying to do something a bit different, have a really interesting story to tell, the guys at Different Drop similarly want to source wines that have a similar vein. So if you go to differentdrop.com/intrepidwino, what you can do is actually find wines made by previous guests of this podcast. And by purchasing those wines, not only do you actually get to find out more about the story that you heard on the podcast, but you actually are supporting those guests who very generously donate their time. And so I really appreciate you guys going to the website. Make sure you're putting in the code INTREPIDWINO at purchase, because then you're going to get a 10% discount, which has been very generously offered by the guys at Different Drop. So thank you very much for the support of this podcast, and I hope you enjoy this episode. On this episode of the Vincast, I chat with David LeMire, MW, a Master of Wine based in Adelaide, who not only works for Shaw & Smith, Adelaide Hills wine producer, but also makes some of his own wine under the Linea brand made from Tempranillo. Hello there, Vincasters, and welcome to another episode of the Vincast. My name is James Garesbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino, and Christmas is very rapidly approaching. Now is a perfect time to be buying wines, not only for celebrations, but also as far as gifts. And I just did a little YouTube Let's Taste video, which will go out very soon. From some Darrenberg wines, very iconic red wines, which were donated by the guys at Darrenberg, which is very flattering. I really appreciate people who are interested to see what I think of their wines. So please, if you are keen for me to have a taste of your wines, I'm more than happy for you to get in touch. But also, I'm more, I would love for you to get in touch if you yourself would like to be on the Vincast, whether or not you would be a guest, or if you'd like to make some sort of contribution. I'm always open to any assistance you might want to provide, and any feedback, of course, is always appreciated. So please go to intrepidwino.com and find out different ways you can get in contact with me, because I love hearing from people. So for this week's episode, I invited my second MW, Master of Wine, David LeMire. David has worked for a number of years for Shaw & Smith, iconic Adelaide Hills wine producer, but has a long history of working in different elements of the wine industry, and more recently has been making some wines under the Linea brand, and also has involvement in a really cool wine bar in Adelaide. So it's really fascinating to hear about his background and kind of why he chose the path that he has. I look forward to tasting more of his wines in the future. But hope you enjoy the episode, guys. I look forward to hearing from you. Make sure to listen to the end so you can find out how. But until then, I'll see you on the other side. David, thank you very much for making some time to be on the Vincast, and welcome as officially my second Master of Wine.
Thanks, James. Pleasure.
And also, first time in a while, I've had a Skype guest on. So thank you very much. Usually I start every episode by asking my guest if they can remember what their first interaction with wine was that kind of set them on the path of wanting to work in the wine industry.
I think, there are a few things that kind of stick out from the early days for me. I was at school with some of the Baileys, who at that time owned with a partner, I reckon they probably owned a dozen bottle shops around Adelaide, and so being at school with two of the sons of that family, a few of us from my school ended up doing a bit of part-time work at those stores in the holidays. So that was sort of my first interaction, and I particularly remember. And as I went through uni, I worked part-time in bottle shops, and there were probably a couple of memorable things. My parents were interested in wine. They used to go up and visit the Barossa, and in particular Henschke, in the 70s. And so they had a pretty nice little stash of Henschkes from the early 70s, and also a few bottles going back into the late 60s. And
they probably would have been quite affordable back then too.
Yeah, well, they were, I mean, Dad was an academic, it was, they weren't, people who spent a huge amount on wine, but they would, they certainly enjoyed it, and they'd come back with, 2 or 3 dozen from an annual trip to Henschke, that sort of thing. So it must have been reasonably affordable. But sadly, I think with my help, we've pretty well got through the bulk of those Henschkes now.
I'm sure they were enjoyed.
Oh, absolutely, they were. There were some great old bottles, and it's nice now. I'm in a wine club with Stephen and Prue, and I know Johan and Justine, and the paths cross a bit, which is kind of nice, and a very Adelaide thing, of course, that everyone knows everyone.
So you were born and you grew up in Adelaide?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so my parents, mum was from Melbourne, dad from Michigan, and
oh wow,
yeah, so they met in the UK. Were based in Canada for a bit, and I was born just after they arrived in Australia. So Dad got a job at Flinders Uni and in the English department there, and so that was my brother and sister were born in Canada. I was born in Adelaide. So the other memorable thing for me from those early days that was. It was a gradual thing, I guess, of really getting into wine and realising that that's what I wanted to do. But there was a leaving party for Aaron Brasher, who was a mate of mine through junior football originally. But Brash was leaving at that time, I think it was called Vintage Cellars, because this is a chain that was sold to Coles in the early 90s, I think it was. And there was a Vintage Cellars at Belair, and the store still exists, but it was a terrific fine wine shop, and Brash was leaving. And the leaving do that night, was, we chipped in and drank, 4 or 5 vintages of Grange. We went through, I think, 4 bottles of Seppelt's Great Western 1964 sparkling Burgundy. And it was just one of those amazing nights where you kind of, it's kind of great fun and revelationary all at the same time, and you're just thinking, wow, this is, it's that thing about wine where you do feel like a kid in a candy store, and I think retaining that the kind of wonder that wine can give you is a really important thing, I think. And I know, Andrew Jefford spoke about this, because I think it is easy. We all get busy in our jobs and life and so on, and just to kind of, and I think in Australia we do that pretty well. We kind of we do get excited about getting together and sharing good bottles, and that's something that I really enjoy about the wine business and the community that we're in.
Yeah. So, so your parents were lovers of wine when you were young. Was food and wine kind of an important thing growing up?
Yeah, look, they were lovers of wine. Food and wine was, it was, they liked good food and wine. They drank wine, a glass of wine pretty much, each night with dinner.
Yeah.
And they weren't foodies the way that, we have this sort of foodie movement now, I guess. But they certainly were into good food and wine, but in a kind of not in a way that they would have considered themselves foodies or anything, but they just...
I guess diversity of cuisine probably was still not quite there, but, in Adelaide, I would think back then.
No. And I guess, having Dad coming from the US and them, living in the UK and Canada and that sort of thing, there was a bit of diversity in their world and a bit of openness to different food and wine.
Sure.
But it was just something in the background. It wasn't sort of a conscious, thing where they're, hunting out new food and wine experiences. They were just kind of, enjoying eating and drinking with friends, and so it was a good environment, but not a foodie environment the way that a lot of us probably get into it a bit more these days.
Well, I know that speaking for myself, growing up, my parents instilled in me a love of good food, not great food necessarily, but my dad was a good cook, and they drank wine, and I suppose being around them, drinking wine with dinner, eventually kind of got me interested in it a little bit more, I guess.
Yeah,
so it's sort of a natural thing, I think.
Absolutely.
Whereas people whose parents didn't drink wine, maybe drank beer or didn't drink at all, kind of might come to it a bit later.
Yeah, and for me it was a very natural thing. I think it was just sort of there in the background. It wasn't something foreign to me. It was just something that I guess I came to it at the age of 18, 19, 20, that sort of age. So reasonably young, I guess, because a lot of people do come to it a bit later.
But were you drinking like wine because it was alcohol, or were you getting interested in sort of drinking good stuff, and sort of were you starting to taste things and learning about different grape varieties, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean that probably, that side of it came as much as anything through the work and the people who I met and friends who were in the wine industry earlier than me and who I worked with at bottle shops, and just so there was that side of it. I mean, as a teenager, and always looking to find trouble, there was kind of, there was alcohol, around in my peer group, probably from a bit earlier than that.
Of course. Because I didn't start drinking wine, I think until I was maybe 19 or 20 at least. Before that, it was beer or, I guess, probably mixed drinks.
Yeah. Ironically, as I got more into the wine business, I probably, got out of, stopped any sort of, well, not stopped entirely, but, I drank in a better way once I was involved in wine. I was less likely to be drinking for the sake of, drinking alcohol.
So this was whilst you were working in retail as you were studying?
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
So what were you actually studying at uni?
So I was doing English and history and a bit of French at uni, and
that's pretty much what I did.
Yeah. No, I did honours in history, and Dad was a professor of English, and so I kind of had that those humanities very much in my blood, I guess.
Yeah. Cool. And was it sort of the retail, experience working with wine that kind of, did you sort of finish your studies and think, well, what could I do now? Because that's what I did.
Yeah, for me, before I'd finished my honours year, I already knew that I wanted to be in the wine industry, and so I kind of, I finished it because I wanted to finish it, and I enjoyed it and still do, enjoy, reading and writing and all of those things that were part of that degree and part of that life, and but by that stage I knew that I wanted to be in the wine business, and so I guess I had a couple of choices. One was to do, what a lot of people were doing, going into the wine business, which was to do, a wine marketing, and I was probably more interested in the sales and marketing side than wine making at that stage.
Yeah.
So I could go and go to Wait, which is where it was, I think, at that time, and do an undergraduate course of, 3 or 4 years more of uni. But having just done 4 years of uni, I was not that keen. I just felt like I needed to get out and do some work as well. So I went down the route of going to the UK, working in, doing some retail work there and doing the WSET diploma over in the UK.
Yeah.
So that was 94, 95 that I was over there and did the WSET and really enjoyed it and enjoyed that whole experience, but also, was exposed to the UK wine market and a very, what I used to call a pure wine market, in that it wasn't influenced overly by its own production. So everything was on an equal footing, and you could buy and drink wine from anywhere in the world pretty much. And so that was incredibly exciting and very formative. And I did the Oddbins thing, which is a bit of a tour of duty for a lot of Aussie wine people at the time, and it was brilliant.
Okay. And was that a really fantastic opportunity to discover wines from other parts of the world as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's where, I think in Australia I'd had an introduction to some of the classics.
But as they possibly related to Australian wine?
Yeah. What the UK gave me was much more breadth of understanding, of not just the classics, but more understanding of the classics, but also a whole lot of, other wines at cheaper price points of, South America, different parts of Italy, lesser parts of France and Spain, that we didn't see much of in Australia, and just a whole context and absolutely understanding Australian wine in a global context. That's kind of been a bit of a theme, I guess, that having that understanding has always been useful for me career-wise to, just to have a feel for how does this stand up stylistically and quality-wise against what's going to be on the shelf in the UK or the US or Hong Kong from France, Italy, Spain, Chile, Argentina, and so on. So I think that global view has been, a really useful thing for me.
So whilst you were living in the UK, working for Oddbins and studying the WSET, did you have the opportunity to do much travel into, for example, other parts of Europe and visit some wine regions?
Yes, I with my girlfriend at the time, now wife, we had some small trips to places that were close, like Champagne and Burgundy, and then we did a bigger tour, which part wine, but also we spent sort of 7 or 8 weeks touring around Europe toward the end of our stint in the UK, and just visited a few more regions, and and that gave me a taste for it, and I guess I've been lucky enough, or somehow managed to be in positions where I've been able to get over to, particularly to Europe, and get back and visit people and visit vineyards and wineries, and probably Burgundy is the one that I visited the most. And I
don't think you're alone there.
I know, but it's it's a pretty special place. But I've just been incredibly lucky to be able to visit wine regions as part of my jobs, and it's something we now do at Shaw and Smith, is that we try and maintain our connection with great wines of the world and contacts with other producers, and just not lose those connections and become isolated here in a region in South Australia.
So after the UK experience and getting to do a bit of travel, what was the next step?
So the next step, I'd been before I went to the UK, I'd been introduced to a lady called Vicky Arnold, who was an export manager for Yalumba, and that their export arm was Negociants International. And so that gave me, and I also had knew other people within that business. And so when I came back and I told, I contacted Vicky and she passed my note on to Robert Hill Smith and John Auld, saying that I was interested in some work, potentially, with them in their wholesale business. And there was a job in Melbourne, and it turned out the guy who was running the Negociants business in Melbourne was a chap called Jeremy Holmes, who is and was at the time a mate of mine, and he was about to leave Negociants to get involved in another business, but he helped me get an interview in Melbourne, which was where there was a role on the road with Negociants Australia. And I kind of didn't impress them particularly at the interview. I found out later, but because I think I was acting too relaxed, mainly because I was nervous, and they thought I didn't really care, because I was obviously successfully looking very, very relaxed about the whole thing. So I started work with Negociants Australia in January of '96.
Okay.
And
at that time, it already had a very strong reputation particularly for wine imports.
Yeah, it had a really strong import portfolio. It was still relatively early days for Negociants Australia there. I mean, the imports had been brought back into Negociants. They were kind of brought in, but they were sold by a business called I.H. Baker before Negociants set up as a distribution business. And then in the early 90s, they set up a domestic portfolio. And, at that time there was some of the ones who are still involved in that business now, like Wirra, Jim Barry, there was Rymel, and there were some that are long gone, like Goundry. We were selling a heap of Goundry unwooded Chardonnay back in those days, and what else was there? There was quite a few things have come and gone. We had Mount Langi Guran back then, and there was a very memorable trip out there, and I can remember a vertical tasting with Trevor Mast of those wines, and that was a pretty amazing experience. And but yeah, it was great fun, and really getting involved in selling wine to the Melbourne trade, and both domestic and imported. And the chap running the imports was a guy called Russell Branton, and he was apart from being a hater of Cabernet, a legendary hater of Cabernet and lover of Burgundy, Russell was supportive in his own sort of very dry way of people who were interested in imported wines. And I can remember, Philip Rich at that stage was, one of the young keen people about, around town, and it was a really interesting time in the, this was 96, 97 in the Melbourne trade.
Hope you're enjoying this episode of the Vincast. Apologies for the interruption, but if you are a great supporter of wine communication, hopefully that's why you listen to this podcast. A really great wine communicator based here in Australia is Wine Companion. Wine Companion, of course, stems from James Halliday, that amazing wine educator, wine communicator who has decades of experience and has chronicled some of the greatest Australian wines ever made. But it has evolved now into an amazing resource on their website where you can get tasting notes and ratings and information about wineries. But also Wine Companion is a magazine that has contributors, some of whom have actually been on this very podcast, who make really great articles, and it's very educational and informative about wine. So I highly recommend going and checking out Wine Companion. If you are a listener of this podcast, the guys at Wine Companion have very generously offered a special discount. If you put in the code Intrepid30 at purchase, you'll get a 30% discount on any subscription package, which is incredible savings. And it's actually a fantastic Christmas gift. So why not give someone the gift of a subscription to Wine Companion, and they will love you at least until next Christmas. So thanks for listening to this episode, guys.
And certainly as far as the wine market and Australian wine, this is a real boom period, and there's a lot of investment going in. And I guess, some of those producers that you mentioned were real icons of modern Australian wine.
Yeah, it was, it probably doesn't feel like a boom when you're in it, I guess, but it just seemed...
Well, compared to when I was starting to really get into the wine, which was 2008,
yeah,
since then the wine market's changed fairly dramatically, with global financial crises and strong Australian dollars and stuff like that. But back then, it just seems things have got bigger and bigger, and particularly as far as exporting of Australian wine.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that was, there was a lot of activity, and there was a lot of planting happening back then as well. People were expanding, new businesses were starting. When a lot of the planting that was done in the 90s resulted obviously in us having too many vines in the ground.
Yeah.
Which the industry, I think, is getting toward dealing with and getting back into balance. But it also meant that you had this this vineyard landscape that you can't change very easily. So when we went in as an industry to a period in the 2000s of stop planting, and stop expanding, we've overshot. What that means is that it's hard to change those vineyards. You've got to live with what you've got for quite a while. So I think that's kind of, I think we're coming out of that a bit, and there's a lot more grafting, and there's a lot more alternative varieties that people are starting to work with. But that did sort of slow down, I think, the evolution of our vineyards, just because we'd gone too hard too quickly in the 90s.
Yeah. And what was the domestic market like? Was the Melbourne trade kind of interested in imported wines?
Well, it was, but it was a lot smaller in terms of the number of people who were really into it. And
had Dan Murphy sort of kicked off at that point?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. They were, they were growing at a rate. Philip Murphy's was this was before Philip Murphy's was sold to Coles Myer.
Yeah.
So that was a separate little chain, and obviously, that, how you have these hubs that Philip Murphy store at Toorak, was one that a lot of people. I mentioned Philip Rich before. There was Michael McNamara, Kate McIntyre. A whole lot of people went through that store, and that was one of those kind of hubs. And then Philip sold that business.
Mm-hmm.
So look, there was a lot going on. There was a kind of a pretty exciting restaurant scene that was it was a really interesting time to be working in Melbourne. It wasn't a really long time for me, because about 15 months or so in about April, May 97, a role came up in export. And in a sense it was, it was a great opportunity, and, it was a promotion and all that sort of thing. In a sense, it would have been nice to have spent longer in Melbourne as part of that team. The guy running the team was a guy called Ian Bird, who was a great mentor. who now lives in Oxford but is still involved in the wine business. So it would have been nice to have had longer in that role, but this export role was one of those opportunities that was too good to miss, really, to get out and about promoting Australian wine. And in this case, it was Yalumba for that Negociants business, but also brands like Jim Barry, Henschke, Vas Felix, that the Negociants business was involved in exporting around the world.
Yeah, okay. So what was the export role?
So Negociants had and still has offices in and businesses in New Zealand, the US, and the UK, where they sell both the proprietary brands, Yalumba and those sort of things, as well as some agency brands. And so I was involved in servicing those, just involved a bit with those offices, but mostly I was working in markets where we didn't have our own offices. So Asia, Canada, Vicky Arnold at that time, who I'd been in touch with before I went to the UK. She looked after Europe, and Brenton Fry, who's just retiring at the end of this year from Negociants, was ran the show for export for Negociants.
Right. Okay.
So it was a pretty small team. It was it was interesting. We worked with quite a few Australian wineries, exporting them around the world, and it's.
And you were servicing a number of different markets around the world, or did you have a focus market?
I was mainly Asia and Canada, so I was just because we had other resources elsewhere, and so I was travelling to those markets and getting to know those markets, which was really interesting, and and nowadays I'm kind of back involved. I spent subsequent to that export role, I went back and ran the imports for Negociants for about 7 years, and then I was kind of out of export really from about 2000 until about 2010. So for a 10 or so year period, I was much more focused on the Australian market again, and now I'm back in more of an international, a role that has a mix of international and domestic.
Right. Okay. So, at what point did you were you continuing your studies as far as WSET, or at what point did you sort of start to move towards the Master of Wine? And when did you first get introduced to it by doing the WSET studies in the UK? Yeah,
I did. So, like after I did the diploma, they sent me a note saying, we think you'd be a good candidate for the MW, and I was like, well, maybe one day, but right now, I'm going to have a break from studying, and that was 95 that I did the diploma. I did both sections at the same time, and loved it. I really enjoyed it so much. Learning about all the different regions. We had, doing it in London. The lecturers were terrific, and there was a lot of interesting wines to try. So I found it really stimulating and interesting. And so in 2002, pretty sure it was 2002 was my first one. I went to I enrolled and went to a seminar, and then got a bit of a taste for what was involved in the MW, and then went back in 2003 and said, right, I'm going to sit the exam in 2004. So at that time, the seminar was in January, and the exams were and still are in June. So I sort of gave myself a pretty solid campaign of 18 months from January 03 to June 04 to get ready for the exams.
Right. Okay. So what are the preparations involved? considering that you'd sort of been continuing to travel and taste and have the opportunity to look at international markets and stuff like that?
So I had a good base in hindsight, which was great, because I did, I'd tasted pretty widely. I'd been in the wine business for a long time. But I, there were lots of gaps, and I guess that was the great thing for me, was that doing the MW, filled in a lot of gaps, gave me a lot of understanding about different parts of the wine business, that I didn't know a lot about. And, we had a tasting group in Adelaide of other people who were either, in the program planning to sit, or who were kind of just keen to develop their palate. Again, it was a really enjoyable process. Studying is pretty good fun, really.
Yeah. So you still had that kind of particular affinity with Burgundy?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was studying, that was my, I would spend, half an hour or 45 minutes learning about, HACCP or ISO or some, international shipping Incoterms or something, fairly uninteresting like all of that, or uninteresting to me anyway. And then I'd kind of reward myself with, a chapter or two of Clive Coates' Burgundy, and just kind of reward myself with reading about Burgundy and just immersing myself with that, which is still useful for your MW studies. But it's that kind of it's got to be fun. I think that process, because it is a pretty long. It's not the easiest thing in the world to do, and you just got to keep nourishing yourself with Burgundy in my case. Yeah, but no, it was good fun, and I stay involved in the MW. Organised a seminar. We just had the seminar a couple of weeks ago in Adelaide, and Jane Skilton MW and I kind of convene that seminar, and it's good fun. And we got a good keen bunch of students, and in the last couple of years we've had some good results with new MWs who've come through the course. So that's it's great to see people get there in the end.
And that is more than likely has really helped you with your different roles, particularly working for Shaw and Smith, which you've been doing for, I think you said, the last sort of 5 years.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, that's it's quite nice, because obviously Michael Hill-Smith, was the first Aussie MW, the first from outside of the UK, and so having two of us here, there's certainly I guess an appreciation of the what it means to be an MW, and kind of the network and the community, and so it kind of makes it easier when I need a bit of time off to go and help run the seminar that Michael and Martin, for that matter, they know what it's all about. So it's great.
And how have you kind of been involved with taking Shaw and Smith to I guess to more markets and growing the brand?
Yeah, Shaw and Smith's been really good for me. I've been incredibly fortunate to be able to come into a business that Michael and Martin have built over 26 vintages, and come in at a time 5 years ago where it was a business in great shape, but there was still an opportunity for me to bring a different perspective and some ideas, and and help the business develop. And part of that's been being involved in new products and projects like the Top Bottle Vineyard down in Tasmania, which has been an incredibly exciting thing to be involved with.
Yeah.
To building our sales and marketing team, which has grown to have a a little bit more emphasis than we did have on direct sales and marketing, which is, a lot of wineries are trying to make those connections with people who are visiting the winery and the tasting room,
which I have done.
Indeed, yeah. So we kind of want to do that as well as we can. We've got a bit more focused. We've got an education kind of culture here. Obviously with a couple of MWs, our winemaker Adam Waterwitz was a Duck Sutherland Evans tutorial, and about mid last year we hired a chap called Dan Coward, who I'm sure you know as well. But
yes.
Dan and Dan is our Australian wholesale trade manager, so he supports red and white, our distributors, and gets out and about into the Australian trade and helps keep us in touch with a lot of our good customers.
It sounds like a pretty amazing team.
It's great, and it's exciting, and it's but it's also it can be, and that was for me one of the good things about it was that was a good step I think I needed to make. I'd been with that Negociants business since January 96 through to mid 07, and then I consulted back for another 3 years. So I was 15 years in total.
Yeah.
And but working as a consultant, it can be a bit isolating, and to come into Shaw and Smith and have this team where you've got Michael and Martin, you've got someone like Adam, you've got people like Dan with it, there's some other really great people in this business. It's so much more interesting, but also you've got to be on your game. You've got to, you don't kind of go into a tasting or have a discussion about wine and quality and style with these guys without being, switched on and really giving the best of yourself.
Sure. And you've also started some projects of your own.
Yeah, so I've got a share in a business called Linea with Peter Lesky, and we focus on Tempranillo in the Adelaide Hills, which has been, which has done really well. It's Peter had been at Nepenthe, and he'd encouraged people in the mid to late 90s, to plant Tempranillo back when people were planting things. Partly because Sangiovese, people were looking for different varieties to experiment with, and Sangiovese had proven very, very tough in the vineyard, partly because the clonal material was rubbish, really. So he encouraged people to plant Tempranillo, and it's done really well. So that's we make red Tempranillo and a rosé, which is proven really popular, and we muck around with a bit of Riesling, but that's more because we like a lot of people in the wine business, we love Riesling, but commercially, it's more of the Riesling thing's more of a sideline because it's a bit of fun, but it's pretty small volume. But the Tempranillo is flying along, and we're really enjoying. That's the first vintage was 07, so we're nearly 10 years in.
And you're also involved in a lovely little wine bar in Adelaide.
I didn't realise how much work it would be, of course.
At Mothervine.
Yes, indeed. And I've said to people like people like Nick Stock, I said, Stocky, why didn't you tell me it was going to be so hard, And he said, I did tell you, Dave. you just didn't listen. So no, but it is good fun. And one of our partners, Frank Hannantan, is a partner in Amalfi, so he brings a great hospitality experience, and Michael Andrew Arthur and Pablo Theodoros from East End Cellars. So there's a good sort of wine team, and it's been good fun and going well.
Well, I certainly love popping into Mothervine when I'm in Adelaide, and I always like grabbing a bottle of La Linea. How do you pronounce it? Linea?
La Linea.
La Linea.
Yep.
Whenever I can, because it's a really it's probably the best Tempranillo expression I've found in Australia so far. So I highly recommend it myself. But David, thank you very much for joining me on the Vincast for this episode.
Thanks, James. Yeah, nice to reflect on.
And if people would like to follow yourself on things like social media, or what's the La Linea website address, if you wouldn't mind sharing those?
So I'm on Twitter at David LeMire, David and then LEMIRE. And www.lalinea.com.au, and also, with Shaw and Smith on various formats as well, and Mothervine, yeah.
I think the website is www.google.com.
That's the one.
But thanks again, and obviously I look forward to catching up with you hopefully in the new year.
And as always, thank you for listening to another episode of the Vincast. I have been James Scaresbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino. Hope you enjoyed it. Of course, you can follow me on social media, on Twitter and Instagram. I am at Intrepid Wino. And on Twitter, you can find the podcast at the Vincast. So please give me a follow. On Facebook, if you go to facebook.com/Intrepid Wino, you'll find my Facebook page, which has lots of links and pictures and stuff like that. If you go to the YouTube channel, Intrepid Wino, and subscribe, you can see some tastings that I've done and will continue to do. And sometimes I actually do live streaming tastings, which is a really fantastic thing to get involved with, because you can actually buy the wines beforehand from Different Drop and actually be able to taste along with us live and share your impressions. Of course, I'd love for you to subscribe to the podcast. You can do it on iTunes, Stitcher, Player FM, a whole range of different podcasting apps on your smartphone of choice. And that way you'll actually be able to download the episode as soon as it becomes available and provide feedback through ratings and reviews. So please, guys, if you have the time, I really would appreciate you give me a rating and a review, because it does give me some fantastic feedback, but also provides feedback to potential listeners and guests as well. All that information is available at intrepidwino.com, my website, along with every episode of the podcast, all the videos, lots of different writings I've done in the past, and all the ways that you can get in contact with me. But I hope we can catch up soon. I've got lots of guests coming up in the coming weeks before Christmas, which is exciting. So until then, bye.